He walked into that hospital to save his fiancée. But the woman on the gurney down the hall, the one with the dark circles and the 8-month belly and nobody holding her hand, that was the one who needed saving. And she was carrying his child. He just didn't know it yet. This is a story about cowardice, silence, and the kind of love that survives both. If you've ever been left without an explanation, or if you've ever been the one who left, this one's gonna hit different. Stay until the end. I promise it's worth it. Before we begin, I just want to say, if you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. Either way, I'm glad you're here. This channel is for people who feel things deeply, people who've loved too hard, forgiven too slowly, or held on to something long after they should have let go. If that sounds like you, you're in the right place. All I ask is this. If this story stays with you, if it makes you feel something real, hit that subscribe button. That's it. One tap. It's free, it costs you nothing, and it means the world to us. It's what keeps these stories coming. All right, let's get into it. The fundraiser had been Gerald Caldwell's idea. It was always Gerald's idea. 200 guests at the plaza, black tie, open bar, Krug on every table, because Gerald believed cheap champagne was a character flaw. The cause was pediatric cardiac research, which was ironic, Nathan thought later, given that nobody in the Caldwell family had ever paid much attention to what was happening inside anyone's chest. Nathan stood near the back of the ballroom with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched, watching his fiancée work the room. Vivian Ashford moved through crowds the way her father moved through Senate hearings, with purpose, with polish, and with the quiet understanding that everyone was watching. She wore a navy gown that cost more than most people's rent. Her blonde hair was pinned up in a way that looked effortless and probably took 2 hours. She was laughing at something the mayor's wife said, her hand resting on the woman's arm, and Nathan thought, not for the first time, that Vivian was better at being a Caldwell than he was. Then Vivian fainted. It happened fast. 1 second she was mid-sentence, wine glass tilted at that perfect angle she'd mastered, and the next, her knees buckled and the glass shattered on the marble, and she was on the floor. The sound cut through everything, the string quartet, the murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware. 200 heads turned at once. Nathan was there in 4 seconds, maybe 5. He couldn't remember later. He just remembered the weight of her as he lifted her, and the way her head lolled against his shoulder, and his father standing 6 feet away with an expression that wasn't concern. It was calculation. Gerald Caldwell was already figuring out how to spin this. "Get the car," Nathan said to nobody in particular. Somebody got the car. He didn't wait for an ambulance. Vivienne came to in the back seat somewhere on Park Avenue, blinking, confused, murmuring that she was fine, that it was nothing, that she'd just skipped lunch. Nathan didn't respond. He drove through 3 yellow lights and 1 red one and pulled up to Mount Sinai at 11:47 p.m. The emergency department smelled the way all emergency departments smell, like hand sanitizer layered over something worse. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that particular frequency that got inside your skull and stayed there. A kid was crying somewhere behind a curtain. The TV in the waiting area was playing a rerun of some game show, the volume too low to hear but too loud to ignore. Nathan walked to the front desk and gave his name. The nurse, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who'd seen everything, looked up, recognized the name, and straightened in her chair. The Caldwell family had donated enough money to this hospital to have their name on 3 different wings. That kind of money buys a certain speed of service. "We'll get her into a private room right away, Mr. Caldwell." Vivian leaned against him, still pale, still saying she didn't need any of this. Nathan kept his hand on her back. Steady, controlled. The version of himself he'd been trained to be since he was 12 years old. The version that handled things, that didn't flinch, that never let anyone see the mess underneath. And then he looked left. He didn't mean to. There was no reason to. It was just one of those meaningless moments, a sound, a movement in his peripheral vision, the squeak of wheels on linoleum. A gurney being pushed down the corridor by 2 nurses moving fast, the kind of fast that meant something was wrong. The woman on the gurney had light brown hair spread across the hospital pillow. Her face was thin, too thin. The kind of thin that comes from months of not eating enough or sleeping enough or both. There were circles under her eyes so dark they looked like bruises. And there was a belly, unmistakable, enormous, 8 months, maybe more, pushing up against the thin hospital sheet like it was trying to escape. Nathan's hand dropped from Vivian's back, because he knew that face. He knew every line of it, every angle, the specific way her jaw tightened when she was trying not to cry. He knew the freckles on her collarbone that came out in summer. He knew the scar on her left wrist from a kitchen accident when she was 19. He knew the way she slept, curled on her right side, one hand tucked under the pillow, always cold feet pressing against his calves at 3 in the morning. Elise Donovan. The gurney disappeared around a corner. Nathan stood frozen in the middle of the corridor, Vivian still talking beside him, the nurse still typing at the desk, the kid still crying behind the curtain, and the only thing he could process was one piece of arithmetic that he couldn't undo. 8 months pregnant, 8 months since he left. Nathan? Vivian's voice, far away. Nathan, what's wrong? He couldn't answer. His mouth opened and nothing came out. His hands were shaking, actually shaking, and he shoved them into his pocket so Vivian wouldn't see. She was looking at him now with something between confusion and the beginning of suspicion, and he needed to say something, needed to explain, needed to— Nothing, he said. Sorry, let's get you checked in. But it wasn't nothing. It was the furthest thing from nothing he'd ever experienced, because the woman on that gurney, the one with the bruised eyes and the enormous belly, being rushed down the hall of the hospital his family funded, was the only person Nathan Caldwell had ever loved, and she was carrying his child, and she was alone. To understand what that moment meant, you'd need to know who Elise Donovan was before Nathan Caldwell ever walked into her life. She grew up in a cramped apartment on Morrison Avenue in the Bronx, the kind of building where the hallway always smelled like cooking grease, and the super took 3 weeks to fix anything. Her mother, Ruth, worked 3 jobs: office cleaning before dawn, elder care in the afternoons, private housekeeping on weekends. Her father was a blank space. Ruth said he left before Elise was born. Then Ruth stopped saying anything about him at all, and Elise learned not to ask. She learned a lot of things early: how to cook dinner at 14, how to stretch $20 across a week, how to guide her mother up the stairs when Ruth came home smelling like cheap vodka and regret, her eyes glassy, her words slurred into something that wasn't language anymore. Elise would take off her mother's shoes, put a glass of water on the nightstand, and close the door. She never cried about it. Crying was for people who expected things to be different. She became a nurse. Not because she had some deep calling. She'd heard that speech at graduation, and it made her want to throw up. But because it was the fastest route to a paycheck that could support 2 people. She finished the accelerated program at Bronx Community College at 23, got hired at Brooklyn Methodist at 24, and had been pulling 12-hour shifts ever since, sometimes 16. The commute from the Bronx to Brooklyn was brutal. The 2 train to the 4, then the transfer at Atlantic that always took longer than it should. But she did it 5 days a week without complaint, because complaining required energy she didn't have. Elise had fair skin, grey-green eyes that darkened when she was angry, and the kind of quiet beauty that she genuinely didn't see when she looked in the mirror. What she saw was the mascara she'd forgotten to take off, the ponytail that was falling apart, the scrubs that still smelled like the antiseptic from the ICU. Her deepest wound wasn't poverty. Poverty was just logistics. Her deepest wound was simpler and worse, the absolute bone-deep conviction that she wasn't enough. Not enough for her father to stay, not enough for her mother to stay sober, not enough for Nathan Caldwell to choose her over everything else. When Nathan left, no warning, no letter, no text, nothing, Elise was barely 2 weeks along. She didn't know yet. Wouldn't know for another month when the nausea started and wouldn't stop. She found out alone in the bathroom of a gas station on Tremont Avenue, holding a $4 test from the CVS on the corner, her hands shaking so hard she could barely read the result. 2 lines. She sat on the floor of that bathroom for 20 minutes. The tile was cracked. Someone had written something obscene on the wall in Sharpie. The fluorescent light flickered every few seconds with a tiny electrical tick that sounded like a clock running out of time. And she made a decision. Not a brave one. Not a dramatic one. Just a decision born from exhaustion and fury and the smallest, most stubborn kind of hope. This child would never feel what she felt. Never. Not if it killed her. Now, 8 months later, Elise was in the ICU at Mount Sinai. Severe preeclampsia, blood pressure spiking, the baby at risk, and there wasn't a single person in the world holding her hand. Nathan sat in the chair next to Vivian's bed and watched her fall asleep. The doctors said it was dehydration and a blood sugar crash. Nothing dangerous. Just what happens when someone skips meals for 3 days to fit into a gown. She'd be discharged in the morning. The monitor beeped. The room was too cold. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed, opened and closed. He stared at the ceiling for 6 hours and didn't sleep at all. At 6:15 a.m., he told Vivian he had an early meeting. She was still groggy from whatever the doctor had given her. She nodded, didn't question it. Vivian never questioned things. That was part of the arrangement. Nathan took the elevator to the 3rd floor. East Wing. Found the shared ward. Pushed open the door. Elise was awake, lying on her side facing the window. The window was dirty, smudged with something nobody had bothered to clean, and it looked out onto a parking lot. The monitors beeped in a rhythm Nathan didn't understand. An IV ran into her left arm. She looked smaller than he remembered, fragile in a way that didn't suit her, because Elise Donovan had never been fragile a day in her life. She didn't turn her head right away when he walked in. 5 seconds, maybe 6. Like her body already knew who it was before her eyes confirmed it. When she finally looked at him, she didn't cry, didn't yell, just spoke in a voice so flat and low it cut deeper than any scream. "Get out, Nathan." He didn't leave. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, and the radiator clanked against the wall behind him. And the parking lot outside was filling up with the first cars of the morning shift, and neither of them said another word. The IV pump clicked softly on its stand. Steady, mechanical, indifferent. The coffee in the nurse's station down the hall had been burning for hours. You could smell it from here. Nathan Caldwell learned how to be invisible inside his own family by the time he was 13. His mother, Catherine, died on a Tuesday in March. Cerebral aneurysm. She went to bed with a headache and never woke up. Nathan found out before school because his father was standing in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, fully dressed in a suit, drinking coffee like it was any other day. And when Nathan walked in and asked where Mum was, Gerald said, "She's gone. The car's coming at 7:15. Finish your breakfast." That was it. No funeral speech about what she meant. No crying in the hallway. No sitting with Nathan on the edge of the bed explaining that sometimes terrible things happen and it's not anyone's fault. Gerald handled his wife's death the same way he handled a bad quarter, with silence, efficiency, and the systematic removal of anything that reminded him the loss had occurred. Catherine's photos came down. Her clothes went to Goodwill in labelled bags. Her reading chair, the one by the window where she used to sit with Nathan on Sunday mornings, was replaced with something leather and expensive that nobody ever sat in. Nathan didn't cry at the funeral. He wanted to. He could feel it in his chest, this pressure building, but Gerald's hand was on his shoulder the entire time, and the weight of that hand said everything. Not here, not now, not ever. Caldwell men didn't break. They managed, and so Nathan managed, through boarding school at Exeter, through 4 years at Wharton, through the slow, methodical ascent to CEO of Caldwell Properties by the age of 30. He managed meetings and mergers and press appearances. He managed the apartment on the Upper East Side that was too big for one person. He managed the therapist on East 72nd, $500 an hour every Wednesday at 4, where he sat on a linen couch and talked about his portfolio and never once mentioned his mother. He managed Vivian, that was the right word for it. She was beautiful, polished, the daughter of Senator Thomas Ashford from Greenwich, Connecticut. Their engagement was covered by Vogue. The ring cost $250,000. Gerald approved. Not with warmth, Gerald didn't do warmth, but with a nod that said, "This is correct. This is how it should be." But there was a thing about Nathan that nobody knew. Not Gerald, not Vivian, not the therapist, not the business press that called him New York's most eligible before the engagement and power couple material after. The thing was this: for 3 years before Vivian, before the engagement, before any of it, Nathan had been in love, real love, the kind that made his hands shake. The kind that made him forget, for entire afternoons, that he was supposed to be someone, Elise Donovan, a nurse from the Bronx who didn't know who the Caldwells were when they first met, genuinely didn't know, which Nathan hadn't believed was possible, and who on their first date at a taco place on Arthur Avenue had laughed at something he said so hard she'd snorted soda through her nose and then laughed harder at herself for doing it. 3 years. They spent 3 years in a world that existed outside of everything Nathan had ever known. Her apartment on Morrison Avenue with the radiator that banged all night and the kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how tight you turned it. The bodega downstairs where the owner, Mr. Reyes, called her Mija and gave her free plantains on Fridays. The nights they spent on her fire escape in July, passing a bottle of cheap rosé back and forth, watching the 6 train rattle past on the elevated track, the windows lit up like moving lanterns against the dark. Elise never asked Nathan about his money, never asked about the company, the properties, the apartment he kept on 85th Street that she'd never seen. She asked him if he was hungry. She asked him why he couldn't sleep. She asked him once, at 2 in the morning after a shift that had broken something in her, whether he thought people who'd been hurt as children were capable of loving normally, or whether they just learned to fake it convincingly enough that nobody could tell. He hadn't answered. He should have. He should have said, "I don't know, but I think we're both finding out." Instead, he kissed her forehead, and she fell asleep on his chest, and the faucet dripped and the train rattled past, and for 3 years that was enough. Then Gerald found out. Nathan started going back to Mount Sinai every morning. He told Vivian he had early meetings. She didn't question it. Vivian operated on a principle of strategic disinterest. She asked questions only when the answers served her, and Nathan's schedule had never been her concern. The first 3 visits were the same. He'd take the elevator to the 3rd floor, East Wing, walk to the shared ward, and Elise would look at him with those grey-green eyes and say some version of the same thing. "Leave. Go away. I don't want you here. You lost that right the day you disappeared." The words varied. The meaning didn't. He sat in the hallway each time, plastic chair, the kind that dug into your back after 20 minutes. The floor had a scuff mark shaped like a crescent moon right in front of her door. He memorized it. He sat there for an hour, sometimes 2. He could hear the machines through the wall, that steady pulse that was supposed to be reassuring, but just reminded him how fragile everything was. Eventually a nurse would come by and give him a look, somewhere between pity and suspicion, and he'd leave. On the 4th visit, he did something Elise didn't know about. He called the hospital's patient services department and arranged, anonymously through his assistant, for Elise to be transferred to a private room. New bed, private bathroom. A window that actually looked out onto something other than concrete. He also contacted Dr. Miriam Okafor, one of the top maternal fetal medicine specialists in Manhattan, and had her assigned to Elise's case. He didn't tell Elise any of this. She found out anyway, because nurses talk and hospital staff recognize money when they see it move through a system, and by the 2nd day in the private room, one of the aides let it slip that someone had made arrangements. Nathan was in the hallway when he heard it. The crash, then the yelling. He ran. Elise was standing barely in the middle of the room, the IV pole knocked sideways, the hospital bracelet ripped off her wrist and thrown on the floor. She was trying to put on her shoes. One sneaker on, one off, the laces untied. She was shaking. The monitor was screaming because she'd pulled the sensor off her finger. "I'm leaving," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. I'm not your charity case, Nathan. I didn't ask for this room. I didn't ask for your doctor. I didn't ask for any of this." Elise, no. She was trying to get the other sneaker on, couldn't bend far enough because of the belly. "I was fine, I was handling it. I've been handling everything alone since you walked out, and I don't need you to—" Her voice stopped. Her face changed. The color drained out of it so fast, it was like watching someone turn off a light. She swayed, grabbed the bed rail, missed. Nathan caught her. She was lighter than he expected. That was the thing that broke something in him. Not the fear, not the guilt, not the monitors screaming, but the weight, or the lack of it. Because this far along and she felt like she weighed nothing, and that meant she hadn't been eating, hadn't been taking care of herself, and all of that was because she was alone, and she was alone because of him. He held her while the nurses ran in. He held her while they got her back on the bed, and reattached the monitors and checked her blood pressure. 178/112, the kind of number that makes medical professionals move fast and speak quietly. He held her hand, and she let him. And he didn't know if she let him because she wanted to or because she was too scared to pull away. When everything stabilized, when the room emptied and the monitors settled back into their rhythm, Elise was lying on her side, eyes closed. Nathan sat in the chair next to the bed. The room was quiet, except for the beeping and the hiss of the heating vent that pushed warm, stale air that smelled vaguely of dust. "I hate you," she whispered, eyes still closed. He didn't respond. "I hate that the baby moves when you talk." Her voice cracked on the last word, just barely. "She kicks every time, like she already knows your voice, and I hate it." Nathan looked at the belly, at the subtle movement under the sheet. A foot, maybe, or an elbow, something impossibly small, pressing outward. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't." "Elise, that word doesn't mean anything coming from you." She opened her eyes. They were wet. "I don't get to say sorry. Sorry is for when you forget someone's birthday. Sorry is for when you're late to dinner. It's not for—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked away. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The heating vent hissed. Somewhere in the hallway a cart rattled past, the dinner service, trays clanking against metal. "I brought you food," Nathan said eventually. "From Angelina's, on Arthur Avenue. You said once that their eggplant parm was the only thing that made winter bearable." Elise stared at the wall. "You remember that?" "I remember everything." Silence. "Leave it on the table," she said finally, "and go." He left the food. He went. When he came back the next morning, the container was empty. She didn't mention it. Neither did he. The days settled into a pattern that neither of them acknowledged. Nathan came every morning between 7 and 8, after telling Vivian he was going to the office. He brought food, different each time, but always from places Elise had mentioned years ago, in conversations she probably didn't remember having. The Thai place on Fordham Road, the bakery near the Grand Concourse that made coconut bread, the soup dumplings from the spot in Flushing that they'd driven 40 minutes to reach on a random Sunday in their second year together. Elise ate the food. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The empty containers said enough. She still didn't want to talk to him. Most mornings she kept her face toward the window and let the silence do the work. But the silence changed. In the first week, it had been a wall. Cold, deliberate, built to keep him out. By the second week, it had loosened, frayed around the edges. The silence of someone who doesn't have the energy to maintain a fortress and grow a human being at the same time. Nathan learned to exist in the quiet. He sat. He read, not on his phone but actual books, paperbacks from the hospital gift shop downstairs, thrillers he didn't care about. He just needed something to do with his hands while he waited for her to decide whether she could stand having him in the room. One night, a Thursday, almost 10 o'clock, Nathan was still there. He'd lost track of time. Elise had been sleeping or pretending to, and the room was dim, just the glow from the monitor and the streetlight outside the window casting long shadows on the wall. He was reading a book he'd forgotten the title of when she spoke. "You cut your hair." He looked up. She was awake, looking at him. "Yeah," he said. "Few weeks ago. It's shorter than you used to keep it." "I guess." "You look tired," he almost laughed. "You should see the other guy." She didn't smile, but something in her face shifted, the tiniest crack in the mask, barely visible, gone in a second. She turned back toward the window. "Good night, Nathan." "Good night, Elise." He stayed another 20 minutes. The book lay open in his lap, unread. Outside the window, an ambulance pulled in. Lights flashing, no siren. The red and white strobed across the ceiling and then went dark. He stood up, put the book on the chair, walked to the door, stopped. "Elise?" "Nothing." "The eggplant parm. Tomorrow. From Angelina's. Same as before." A pause. Long enough that he thought she'd fallen asleep. "Extra basil," she said. Quiet. Almost nothing. He nodded, even though she couldn't see it, and pulled the door shut behind him. The latch clicked. His footsteps faded down the corridor, past the nurse's station where someone had left a half-eaten granola bar on the counter, past the elevator with the out-of-order sign that had been there for 3 days, and out into the November night. The air smelled like exhaust and cold rain on asphalt. Somewhere on Madison a cab honked. Then nothing. Vivian Ashford was not a stupid woman. That was the thing people misunderstood about her. They saw the blonde hair, the senator's daughter pedigree, the Vogue spreads, and they assumed she was decorative, a fixture, the kind of woman who smiled at fundraisers and didn't read the fine print, but Vivian read everything. She'd grown up in Greenwich with a father who won 3 elections by knowing before anyone else in the room who was lying. Thomas Ashford taught his daughter 2 things: always control the narrative and never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. She'd noticed the changes in Nathan 3 weeks ago, the early mornings, the phone he kept face down on the nightstand, which he'd never done before, the way he came home smelling like hospital, that specific antiseptic scent that clings to clothes the way cigarette smoke used to. She noticed the weight loss, the circles under his eyes, the way he sat at dinner and moved food around his plate without eating, staring at some middle distance she couldn't reach. She didn't ask, not because she was passive, but because she was strategic. She waited, she watched. She logged the patterns the way her father logged voting data, methodically, without emotion, building a picture. On a Tuesday evening in late November, the picture completed itself. It was raining. One of those cold Manhattan rains that turns the sidewalks into mirrors and makes the whole city feel like it's dissolving. Vivian told her driver to take her to Mount Sinai. She didn't explain why. She walked into the lobby, heels clicking on the marble, and asked the woman at the information desk if Nathan Caldwell was visiting a patient. The woman hesitated. Vivian smiled, the particular smile she used on people who were about to make her life difficult, and the woman checked the system and said 3rd floor, East Wing, room 312. Vivian took the elevator up. The hallway on the 3rd floor smelled like microwaved soup and floor cleaner. A nurse pushed a cart past her without looking up. The lights hummed. Room 308, 310, 312. The door was half open. She stopped. Nathan was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, not in the chair, on the bed itself, next to a woman Vivian had never seen before. A woman with light brown hair and dark circles, and a belly that could only mean one thing. The woman was asleep, and Nathan was holding her hand. Not casually, not the way you hold a stranger's hand out of obligation. He was holding it with both of his, cradling it against his chest. And his head was bowed, and from the doorway Vivian could see the rise and fall of his shoulders, unsteady, like he was trying not to cry or had just finished. Vivian stood in the hallway for 9 seconds, she counted. An old habit from childhood. When things went wrong, she counted, because numbers didn't lie and emotions did. Then she pushed the door open the rest of the way. Nathan's head snapped up. His eyes were red. The woman, Elise. Though Vivian didn't know the name yet, stirred but didn't wake. Vivian, don't. Her voice was calm, perfectly controlled. The same voice she used at her father's campaign events, when a reporter asked something designed to provoke. Don't explain, don't insult me. She looked at the woman in the bed, at the belly, at Nathan's hands, still wrapped around the woman's fingers. And Vivian did the math the same way Nathan had done it weeks earlier in the ICU corridor, quickly, ruthlessly, and with the understanding that the result would change everything. I'm going to call my father, she said. Then I'm going to call yours. The engagement is over. Your family will know by morning. She paused, adjusted her coat. You can keep the ring. I never liked it. She turned and walked out. Her heels on the linoleum sounded like a metronome, even, measured, unhurried. She didn't slam the door, didn't raise her voice, didn't look back. Vivian Ashford left the way she did everything, with precision. Nathan sat in the silence she left behind. His hands were empty now. Elise had shifted in her sleep and pulled away without knowing it. The heart rate number on the screen pulsed green. 72, 73, 71, steady and oblivious. Rain hit the window in uneven bursts. He thought about going after Vivian but didn't move, because going after her would mean this was about her, and it wasn't. It hadn't been for a long time. Elise woke up 20 minutes later. She blinked at the ceiling. looked at Nathan. "What happened?" "Nothing. You look like something happened. Go back to sleep." She didn't push it. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up over her shoulder, and closed her eyes. Nathan watched her breathe, even and slow, the most peaceful he'd seen her in weeks. He stayed until midnight. Then he drove home to the apartment on 85th Street, where Vivian's closet was already half empty. Gerald Caldwell arrived at Mount Sinai the following afternoon at 2:15 p.m. He came alone. No assistant, no driver waiting downstairs, no advance call to the hospital. He simply appeared, the way Gerald always appeared, as if the building had been expecting him, and rearranged itself accordingly. Nathan was in the chair by the window. Elise was sitting up in bed, eating the remains of a soup that Nathan had brought from a place on Mott Street. She had a napkin tucked into her hospital gown and a plastic spoon in her hand, and for the first time in weeks, she looked almost okay. Color in her cheeks, something close to calm in her eyes. Gerald opened the door without knocking. The room changed. Nathan could feel it happen. The way the air itself seemed to compress, like the walls had moved 6 inches closer. Gerald stood in the doorway in his overcoat, silver hair combed back, looking at Elise with an expression Nathan had seen 1,000 times in boardrooms, the face Gerald made when he was about to close a deal that benefited only him. "Dad." "Sit down, Nathan." Nathan was already sitting. Gerald knew that. It was a power move, telling someone to do something they were already doing, making them feel like their position was his decision. Gerald looked at Elise, studied her the way you'd study something on a spreadsheet, without emotion, without recognition of her as a person, just as a variable in a calculation that wasn't adding up. "I must be the nurse," he said. Elise put the soup down. The spoon clinked against the plastic container. She didn't respond. "I'll be brief." Gerald unbuttoned his coat but didn't take it off. "I've known about this pregnancy for 4 months. My attorney contacted you in August with an offer. $200,000 to relocate out of state and relinquish any claim, legal or otherwise, to the Caldwell name. You declined." The room was so quiet Nathan could hear the fluorescent light buzzing overhead. That tiny, maddening hum. Elise's face didn't change. Her hands were in her lap still. She was looking directly at Gerald. "I declined," she said, "which was your right." Gerald's tone suggested it was also her mistake. "But the situation has changed. My son's engagement to Vivian Ashford ended last night. A press release will go out this afternoon. The tabloids already have the story. Billionaire heir leaves fiancée for pregnant ex-girlfriend. You can imagine how that plays. I don't care how it plays." "No, I don't suppose you would." Gerald turned to Nathan. "Here's what's going to happen. If you pursue this, whatever this is, you will lose your position at Caldwell Properties. The board will vote you out by Friday. Your trust fund will be frozen pending a review that I will ensure takes years. Your name will remain Caldwell, but it won't mean what it used to. Nobody in our circle will touch you. You understand what I'm saying?" Nathan's jaw was tight. He could feel his teeth pressing together, the muscle in his temple pulsing. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to say something. But the words were stuck, jammed somewhere between his throat and the part of his brain that had spent 34 years learning to obey this man. "This girl," Gerald continued, gesturing at Elise without looking at her, "could have resolved this quietly, could have taken the money and built a perfectly decent life somewhere else. She chose to be stubborn." "Dad, stop. I'm not finished." Gerald's voice dropped, not louder, quieter, which was always worse. "I built this family from nothing. Your grandfather drove a truck. I put this name on buildings, and I will not watch you dismantle it for—" He paused, looked at Elise. "For this." The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind that's full of things nobody can say. Gerald buttoned his coat, adjusted his cuffs, walked to the door. "You have a week," he said to Nathan. "Make a decision." The door closed behind him. Not a slam, just a click. Gerald didn't slam doors. He didn't need to. Nathan sat in the chair. His hands were gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles were white. He couldn't look at Elise. He knew what he'd see. Not anger, because anger would have been easier. Anger he could have fought. What he'd see would be worse. Understanding. The quiet, brutal understanding of a woman who'd spent her whole life watching people choose something else over her. Elise, don't. I'm not going to... Nathan. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. That was the part that destroyed him. Go home. I'm not leaving. Go home. Talk to your father. Figure out what you want. She paused. And this time, when you decide to leave, at least have the decency to say it to my face. He looked at her then. She was looking at him with the same expression he'd seen the first time he walked into this room. Flat, controlled, the mask in place. But her eyes were wet. Just barely. 2 tears sitting on the edge of her lower lashes, refusing to fall. I'm not leaving, he said again. She turned away. Everyone leaves, Nathan. You just took longer than most. He sat there for another hour. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The only sound was the soft hiss of the oxygen line and the rain hitting the window. The soup went cold on the table. At some point, a nurse came in to check vitals, glanced between them, and left without a word. At 9 o'clock, Nathan stood up. He needed to think, needed to call his lawyer, needed to figure out if there was a way to keep the company and keep Elise and keep his sanity. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he already knew the answer was no. That Gerald had designed it that way, that the choice was binary by construction. I'll be back tomorrow, he said from the doorway. Elise didn't respond. I'll be back, he repeated. Nothing. He left. He came back at 7 the next morning, walked to room 312, opened the door. The bed was made. The sheets were tucked in with the military precision of hospital housekeeping. The table was cleared. The monitors were off. The window was closed. Elise was gone. Nathan stood in the empty room. The smell of industrial cleaner hung in the air. Lemon-scented, chemical. The kind of clean that exists to erase all evidence that someone had ever been there. He looked at the nightstand. Empty. The chair where he'd sat for hours. Empty. The hook on the back of the door where her jacket used to hang. Empty. He went to the nurse's station. The morning shift nurse, a young woman with box braids and a lanyard full of keychains, checked the system and said that Elise Donovan had signed herself out, AMA, at 3:47 a.m. Against medical advice. She'd left in a taxi, no forwarding address, no emergency contact on file. Did she say where she was going? I wasn't on shift, sir, I'm sorry. Nathan called Dr. Okafor. Voicemail. Called the hospital's patient advocate, the social worker, the front desk. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had thought to stop a pregnant woman with dangerously high blood pressure from walking out of a hospital in the middle of the night, because nobody had been told to. He stood on Madison Avenue in the grey morning light, phone in his hand, and felt something he hadn't felt since he was 12 years old, standing in the kitchen while his father told him his mother was gone. Panic. Real panic. The kind that doesn't announce itself with a pounding heart or shallow breath, but with a horrible, expanding stillness. The feeling of standing in a room where something essential has been removed, and knowing, with absolute certainty, that you're the reason it's missing. He called his investigator, then another one, then a third. The city had 9 million people. Elise Donovan was one of them, and she didn't want to be found. Nathan sat in his car on 98th Street, engine running, heat on full. The dashboard clock said 8:22 a.m. His coffee sat in the cup holder, untouched, going cold. His phone was in his hand, screen dark. He sat there for 45 minutes. Then he drove to the office, walked into a board meeting he'd forgotten about, and said absolutely nothing for 2 hours. His assistant asked if he was feeling all right. "I'm good," he said. He wasn't. The first week after Elise disappeared, Nathan did everything wrong. He hired investigators, 3 of them, from 3 different firms, because he didn't trust any single person to care enough. He gave them everything: her address on Morrison Avenue, the hospital where she worked, her mother Ruth's name, the phone number he still had saved in his contacts under a first name with no last name, as if reducing her to 5 letters could make her less real. The investigators came back with nothing useful. The apartment on Morrison Avenue was empty. The super, an older Dominican man who spoke mostly in Spanish and mostly through a closed door, said she'd packed 2 bags and taken a cab somewhere around midnight, maybe 1 a.m., a few weeks back. He didn't know where, didn't ask, wasn't his business. His Brooklyn Methodist said Elise had called in sick for the last 6 weeks and then stopped calling altogether. Her employee file listed her mother, Ruth Donovan, as emergency contact at an address in Morris Heights. Nathan drove there on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a walk-up on University Avenue, the hallway smelling like mildew and something fried. He knocked on the door for 10 minutes. A neighbor, an older black woman in a house dress carrying a bag of groceries, told him Ruth hadn't been around in weeks. She went to stay with her sister upstate, I think. Albany, maybe. She's not well, you know. The lungs. Nobody knew where Elise was. Nathan started driving the Bronx at night, not searching. Exactly. He didn't know what he was looking for, but unable to sit still in the apartment on 85th Street, where the silence was so complete, it felt like a sound. He drove past Morrison Avenue, past the gas station on Tremont, where she'd taken the pregnancy test, past the bodega, where Mr. Reyes used to give her free plantains, which now had a different sign and a different owner, and no memory of Elise Donovan at all. He drove until the gas light came on, then he drove some more. The city looked different at 3 in the morning, stripped down, honest, just cold pavement and streetlights, and the occasional person walking fast with their head down. Nathan drove through neighborhoods he'd never been to, past buildings that looked nothing like the ones his family owned, and he thought about the fact that Elise had navigated this city every day of her life, the same city, the same streets, and seen something completely different from what he saw, a different New York, one without a safety net. At the office he was useless. He sat in meetings and heard nothing. His COO, a woman named Deborah Chen who'd been with Caldwell Properties for 15 years and didn't tolerate nonsense, pulled him aside on a Thursday and told him bluntly that he looked terrible and the Mercer Street deal was falling apart because nobody was returning calls. "Take a week off," she said. "I'm fine." "Nathan, you're wearing the same shirt you wore yesterday." He looked down. She was right. Same wrinkled Oxford, same coffee stain near the 3rd button. He hadn't noticed. "Take a week," Deborah repeated. "I'll handle the board." He took the week. He spent it in his apartment, which was too clean and too quiet and too big. The cleaning service came on Mondays and Thursdays, and the place always smelled like some organic lavender product that Vivienne had chosen, and that Nathan had never thought about until now, when the smell made him nauseous. Vivienne's things were mostly gone: the closet, the bathroom shelf, the stack of French fashion magazines on the coffee table. Her lawyer had sent a formal letter ending the engagement, CCing Gerald's lawyer, with the language of someone dissolving a business partnership rather than a relationship. The tabloids ran the story for a week. Page 6, the Daily Mail, some gossip account on Instagram with 2 million followers that Nathan had never heard of. Caldwell air dumps senator's daughter. Who's the mystery pregnant woman? They didn't have Elise's name yet, which was the only small mercy. But the photos from the fundraiser, Nathan carrying Vivienne out, both of them in black tie, her limp in his arms, ran alongside speculation that made Nathan's stomach turn. One outlet called Elise a former fling. Another called her an alleged mistress. She would have hated both words equally. Gerald didn't call, that was the punishment, and Nathan knew it. Gerald had deployed silence the way other people deployed lawyers, surgically without warning, and with the understanding that the absence of communication was itself a message. The message was, "You've been warned. You chose wrong. Now deal with the consequences alone." And alone was exactly what Nathan was. In the 2nd week, the dreams started. Not nightmares exactly. Just the same dream. Over and over. He was in the hospital room, room 312, and Elise was in the bed and the monitors were beeping, and he was sitting in the chair and everything was fine. Calm, the way it had been during those quiet evenings when neither of them spoke, and the silence was warm instead of cold. And then he'd look at the bed and Elise would be gone. Just the made bed, and the tucked sheets and the smell of lemon cleaner. And he'd stand up to look for her and the door would be locked, and the monitors would start screaming, and he'd wake up with his heart hammering and the taste of copper in his mouth. He lost 12 pounds. His assistant, a young guy named Marcus, who was too polite to say anything directly, started leaving protein bars on Nathan's desk. Nathan ate them because he couldn't think of a reason not to. On a Friday night at the end of the second week, Nathan did something he'd never done. He called his therapist outside of their scheduled Wednesday session. Dr. Whitfield answered on the fourth ring. She sounded surprised, which was fair. In 6 years of weekly sessions, Nathan had never once called between appointments. "I can't find her," Nathan said. No preamble, no small talk. "Find who?" "Elise. She left the hospital. She's nearly 9 months pregnant. She has preeclampsia. Her blood pressure was 178/112 last time they checked, and she walked out against medical advice and nobody knows where she is." Silence on the line. "And I just—" He stopped, sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. The city glowed outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, all those buildings he owned or could buy, and none of it meant anything. I keep thinking about what she said, that everyone leaves, and she's right. Everyone in her life has left. Her dad, her mom in the ways that count, and then me. I did the same thing. I did exactly the same thing, and I told myself it was for her protection, and that's— He laughed. It wasn't funny. That's what every coward says. I was protecting her. Right. I was protecting myself. Nathan, she's alone. She's out there, alone, 9 months pregnant with my kid. And I don't know if she's eating. I don't know if she's seeing a doctor. I don't know if she's sleeping. And every morning I wake up and check my phone and there's nothing. And I realize this is what I did to her. This exact thing, all those months of nothing, all that silence. He pressed his palm against his eye. It was shaking. I need to find her, and I don't know how. Dr. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. What will you do when you find her? I don't know. What do you want to do? He thought about it, really thought about it in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before, because thinking about it meant admitting things that couldn't be unadmitted. I want to be there, he said. When the baby comes, I want to be in the room. I want to— His voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. I want to be the kind of person who stays. I don't know how to do that. I've never seen it done. My dad didn't. My mum died and he just kept going like she was a quarterly loss he could absorb. And I learned that. I learned to absorb people, to let them in, and then cut the loss when it got too expensive. And Elise? Elise was never a loss I could absorb. Silence. Then tell her that, Dr. Whitfield said. When you find her, tell her exactly that. The third week was the worst because it was quiet. The tabloids moved on. A tech CEO got caught in some scandal and the news cycle shifted. Gerald's silence continued. The investigators sent daily reports that said the same thing in different words. No leads, no sightings, no activity on any known accounts. Nathan started going through old photos on his phone. Not the posed ones, the accidental ones. Elise at the taco place on Arthur Avenue with hot sauce on her chin. Elise asleep on the fire escape with a book on her chest, the 6 train blurred in the background. Elise laughing, mouth open, eyes closed, the kind of laugh that took over her whole body. He'd taken that one without her knowing. She would have told him to delete it. He never did. He stared at the photos until 2-3 in the morning, sitting on the floor of the apartment with the lights off and the city outside the window, and he understood something. He should have understood a long time ago. That the reason he'd obeyed his father, the reason he'd walked out of that apartment on Morrison Avenue without looking back, wasn't really about protecting Elise from Gerald. It was about protecting himself from the vulnerability of choosing her, because choosing Elise meant choosing something Gerald would never approve of, and Gerald's approval was the only form of love Nathan had ever known, and losing it, even the pale, conditional, transactional version Gerald offered, terrified him more than losing anything else. Until now, because now the only thing that terrified him was a phone that didn't ring. On the 22nd day at 3:14 a.m. it rang. Nathan was awake. He'd been awake for hours, sitting in the kitchen with a glass of water he hadn't touched. His phone was on the counter, face up, the way it always was now. The caller ID said Martinez, his lead investigator. "We found her," Martinez said. "Lincoln Medical Center, Bronx. She came in through the ER about 4 hours ago. Premature labor. There were complications. I don't have details. I'm not family. But she's there." Nathan was already putting on shoes. He grabbed his keys, his wallet, his phone. Didn't check the mirror. Didn't change the shirt he'd been wearing since yesterday. He made it to the Lincoln Medical Center in 19 minutes, ran 2 red lights, parked in a loading zone, walked into the emergency room with his shirt on inside out and 3 weeks' worth of sleeplessness carved into his face. The nurse at the desk told him he couldn't go up. He said he was the father. She said there was no authorization on file. He said he wasn't leaving. She picked up the phone to call security. And then a doctor came through the double doors, a tall woman in scrubs with a surgical cap still on her head, and the kind of exhaustion that only comes from saving lives, and asked, looking at the small crowd at the desk, if there were any family members of Elise Donovan present. Nathan stepped forward. "I'm the father." The doctor looked at him, assessed him the way doctors assess everyone, quickly, clinically, with the understanding that the next words out of her mouth would rearrange this person's entire life. "Ms. Donovan is stable," she said. "Her blood pressure spiked during labor, but we managed it. She's resting now." Nathan's knees almost buckled. He put a hand on the counter. "The baby?" "A girl. 5 pounds, 2 ounces. Premature but breathing independently. She's in the NICU for monitoring, but the prognosis is good." "A girl." Nathan leaned against the wall. Then he slid down it. He sat on the floor of the emergency room at Lincoln Medical Center in the Bronx at 4 in the morning wearing a shirt that was inside out. And he put his face in his hands and he stayed like that for a long time. The floor was cold. The vending machine across the hall hummed. An orderly walked past pushing an empty wheelchair, one wheel squeaking with every rotation. Nobody asked him to move. The nurse let him up at 5:30 a.m. She walked him to the elevator, pressed the button for the 4th floor and told him room 414, end of the hall on the left. She didn't smile. She didn't offer encouragement. She just handed him a visitor badge and said, "She's been through a lot, keep your voice down." Nathan walked down the hallway. The linoleum was scuffed and dull under the fluorescent lights, which had that yellowish tint that made everyone look slightly ill. A whiteboard outside room 410 had a nurse's name written in blue marker. Keisha, night shift. A phone rang at the nurse's station, and nobody answered it for 4 rings. 5. Then it stopped. Room 414. The door was closed. He stood outside it for 2 full minutes. He could hear the monitor through the door. That steady beep he'd memorized over the weeks at Mount Sinai. He could hear her breathing, or imagined he could. His hand was on the door handle, and his palm was sweating, and he thought absurdly about what he looked like. Shirt inside out, 3 weeks of bad sleep, probably smelling like the car he'd driven here in a panic at 3 in the morning. He pushed the door open. Elise was awake, propped up against the pillows, face toward the window. The window here was clean, cleaner than the one at Mount Sinai anyway, and the sky outside was that dark blue that comes right before dawn, not quite black, not quite anything else. A blood pressure cuff was still wrapped around her upper arm, the Velcro fraying at the edge. An IV ran into her hand. She looked smaller than the last time he'd seen her, which shouldn't have been possible. Her hair was limp against the pillow, and her lips were dry, and there was a bruise on the inside of her elbow from where someone had missed a vein. She turned her head when he walked in. She didn't look surprised. That was the thing. She looked at him the way you look at something inevitable, a bill you knew was coming, a storm you watched build on the horizon. Her face held no relief, no anger, only the quiet acknowledgement of someone who'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop and had just heard it hit the floor. "I didn't call you," she said. "I know. I don't need you here." "I know that too." "Then why?" Nathan walked to the chair by the bed and sat down. The vinyl seat let out a small hiss of air. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He stared at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Because I was a coward," he said. "That's the answer to every question you've ever wanted to ask me. Why I left, why I didn't call, Why I didn't fight my father. Why I showed up at Mount Sinai and then couldn't say the right thing when it mattered. Cowardice. Every time. Elise watched him. Her expression didn't change. My dad called me into his office last spring and told me that if I didn't end things with you, he'd destroy your career. He'd pull the insurance your mum depends on. He'd make sure you couldn't work at any hospital in this city. Nathan's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. His fingers were laced together so tightly, his knuckles were going white. And I told myself that leaving you was the brave thing, the sacrifice, that I was taking the bullet so you wouldn't have to. And that's... He exhaled, short, sharp, like something breaking. That's the most selfish lie I've ever told myself, because I wasn't protecting you. I was protecting myself from having to choose, because choosing you meant losing everything my father built, everything I was raised to be, and I was too scared to find out who I am without it. He paused. The IV pump hummed on its stand. Outside the window, the sky was lightening, that thin grey line along the horizon that meant morning was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. And then I saw you at Mount Sinai on that gurney, alone, pregnant, and I realized that the thing I was so scared of losing, the company, the name, my father's approval, none of it was real. None of it kept me warm. None of it asked me how I slept. None of it laughed until soda came out its nose at a taco place on Arthur Avenue. Something shifted in Elise's face. Not much. A softening around the eyes, or maybe just exhaustion moving through in a different way. She was gripping the edge of the blanket with one hand, the fabric bunched in her fist. You walked out without a word, she said. Quiet. Almost a whisper. 8 months. Do you know what that's like? Waking up every morning and checking your phone and there's nothing? Wondering what you did wrong? Going over every conversation, every moment, trying to figure out where you lost someone? Yes, Nathan said. I know exactly what it's like. Because you did it to me 3 weeks ago. Silence. Elise's eyes widened, just slightly. Like the symmetry of it, the cruelty of it, hadn't occurred to her until he said it. And I deserved it, he said. Every second of it. Every morning I woke up and checked my phone and there was nothing. I thought, this is what I did. This is what all those months of silence feel like from the other side. And it was the worst thing I've ever felt. And it still doesn't compare to what I put you through, because you didn't choose to leave. I did. Elise looked away. Her chin was trembling. Not obviously, but Nathan saw it because he knew her face better than he knew his own. She pressed her lips together, swallowed, breathed. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I know that's not how it works. I know I can't show up at 4 in the morning with my shirt on backwards, inside out. What? Your shirt's inside out, not backwards. He looked down. The seams were showing. The tag was sticking up at the collar. He'd driven across the city in a panic and hadn't noticed. Something happened on Elise's face. Not a smile. Not even close. But the ghost of something. A flicker. Like a match struck in a dark room that doesn't quite catch. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said again. I'm telling you that I'm here. And I know that doesn't mean much because I was here before and then I wasn't. So I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to let me show up tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. Until it means something. Elise was quiet for a long time. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly. A door opened somewhere down the hall. Voices, footsteps, then quiet again. Dawn was coming through the window now, pale and thin, turning the walls from grey to something almost gold. Have you seen her? Elise asked. No. She's in the NICU, 4th floor, other side of the building. Elise's voice changed when she talked about the baby. Something underneath the exhaustion, underneath the anger, a warmth she couldn't hide, even when she was trying. She's small, 5 pounds, but she's breathing on her own. The nurse said she has your chin. My chin? Unfortunately. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something much earlier than that. The first tentative step onto ground that might not hold, taken by someone who had every reason to stay where she was. Her name is Hope, Elise said. I picked it when I was 6 months along, sitting in a laundromat on Grand Concourse at midnight, because the washing machine in my building was broken. And I thought, this kid is going to need a name that means something, because I don't have money, I don't have family, I don't have a plan, but I have this stupid, stubborn thing in my chest that won't let me quit. And I figured if I named her that, maybe she'd get it too. Nathan's vision blurred. He blinked. His eyes were burning, and his throat was tight, and he was 34 years old and sitting in a hospital in the Bronx crying, and he didn't care. "Can I see her?" he asked. Elise studied him, searching for something. Insincerity, maybe, or the calculation she'd seen in his eyes during Gerald's visit at Mount Sinai. She looked for a long time, and Nathan let her look. He didn't try to arrange his face into anything. He just sat there, raw and wrecked, with his inside-out shirt and his wet eyes and his shaking hands, and let her see all of it. "Yeah," she said. "You can see her." The NICU was a different world. Quiet in a way that regular hospital floors weren't. A deliberate, careful quiet, like the whole wing was holding its breath. The lights were low. The nurses moved in soft shoes. Everything was designed to be gentle. A nurse named Denise, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and scrubs covered in cartoon penguins, walked Nathan to the incubator. She told him to wash his hands, showed him how to use the handholds in the side of the unit, and then stepped back. Nathan looked through the clear plastic. She was small, impossibly small. A red, wrinkled 5-pound person with a disproportionately round head and tiny fists clenched against her chest. She wore a white cap and was wrapped in a hospital blanket with thin blue and pink stripes. A sensor was taped to her foot, and a thin tube ran under her nose, and she was breathing, visibly, rhythmically, her tiny chest rising and falling. Nathan put his hand through the hole. His index finger was almost the size of her entire hand. He touched her arm. Warm, incredibly warm for something so small. She moved. A tiny shift, her head turning slightly, her mouth opening and closing, a micro-expression that could have been anything but that Nathan, irrationally and completely, interpreted as acknowledgement. "Hey," he whispered. "I'm your dad. I know I'm late. I'm sorry about that." The baby didn't respond. Obviously. She was less than 12 hours old and sound asleep, but her hand uncurled, just barely, and her fingers grazed Nathan's fingertip, and the touch was so light it was almost nothing, but it wasn't nothing. It was everything. It was the furthest thing from nothing he'd ever experienced. Denise was standing a few feet away, pretending to check a chart, giving him space. Nathan stayed at the incubator for 40 minutes. He didn't move, didn't check his phone, didn't think about the company or his father or the tabloids or any of the things that had seemed so important 4 weeks ago. When he finally stepped back, his legs were stiff and his back ached from bending over the unit. He thanked Denise. She told him the visiting hours for parents. He started to correct her. "I'm not sure I count as a parent yet," and then stopped, because Denise had said it with such casual certainty that correcting her felt wrong. He walked back to room 414. Elise was asleep. Actually asleep this time, not pretending, not lying still with her eyes closed, waiting for him to leave. Her face was relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in weeks. One hand rested on her belly, on the space where the belly had been, now deflated, soft, changed. Nathan sat in the chair. He didn't touch her, didn't wake her, just sat there, in the ugly vinyl chair in the dim room, listening to the rhythm of her breathing and the soft tick of the IV pump, while the morning light crept across the floor. At 7:45 a.m. he took out his phone and typed a text, not to his father, not to his lawyer, not to his assistant, to Gerald. "I'm at Lincoln Medical Center. Elise had the baby last night. A girl. Her name is Hope. I'm not asking for your blessing, and I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you as your son that I'm choosing them. Both of them. If that costs me the company, the trust, the name, fine, I'll figure it out. But I'm done running. And I'm done being afraid of you." He read it twice. Then he hit send. The message showed delivered at 7:47 a.m., then read at 7:48 a.m. No reply came. Nathan put the phone face down on the armrest and closed his eyes. Outside, the Bronx was waking up. Buses rumbled on the Grand Concourse. A car alarm went off 2 blocks away and stopped after 30 seconds. Somewhere a kid was laughing, that high, breathless kind of laugh that only kids under 5 can produce. Nathan fell asleep in the chair. First time in 3 weeks. 7 months later. The apartment was on Valentine Avenue. 3rd floor, walk up, no elevator. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, hardwood floors that creaked in the hallway, and a kitchen window that looked out onto a fire escape. And beyond that, the elevated train tracks where the 4 train rattled past every 12 minutes. It wasn't much. Nathan knew that. He also knew it was the first place that had ever felt like anything to him. He'd signed the lease in January, 3 weeks after Hope came home from the NICU. Elise hadn't asked him to move in. She'd made that very clear. "This isn't us getting back together," she'd said, standing in the doorway of her new apartment with Hope in a carrier on her chest, looking at Nathan with an expression that was half warning, half something she wasn't ready to name. "This is you being here for your daughter. That's it. That's the arrangement." "That's the arrangement," he'd agreed. The arrangement lasted about 6 weeks before it stopped being an arrangement and started being something else. It happened the way real things happen, not with a speech or a grand gesture, but in pieces. Small, ordinary, unremarkable pieces that only mattered because of who was in the room. Like the night Hope wouldn't stop crying. 3 a.m. February. The radiator hissing, the apartment freezing because the heat in the building was unreliable, and the landlord took 4 days to respond to anything. Nathan was pacing the hallway with Hope against his chest, bouncing the way the internet said to bounce, gentle, rhythmic, supporting the head, and nothing was working. She'd been crying for 2 hours. Her face was red and furious, and her tiny fists were balled up, and she was producing a volume of sound that seemed physically impossible for something that weighed 7 pounds. Elise came out of the bedroom in a t-shirt and sweatpants, hair a disaster, eyes puffy. She'd been sleeping, or trying to. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight in weeks. "Give her to me. You should sleep. Nathan, give her to me." He handed Hope over. Elise took her, repositioned her so the baby was lying across her forearm, belly down, some hold she'd learned from a YouTube video at 4 in the morning, and started walking the hallway, back and forth, back and forth. The floor creaked under her bare feet. Hope screamed for another 4 minutes, then 3. Then the screaming turned to whimpering, then to hiccups, and then to silence. Elise stood in the hallway, swaying, the baby asleep on her arm. She looked up at Nathan. He was leaning against the kitchen doorframe, exhausted, his hair sticking up, wearing a Bronx Community College sweatshirt that Elise had found at a thrift store and bought as a joke, and that he now wore every single night. "How'd you do that?" he asked. "Witchcraft." "Seriously?" "I don't know. She likes the forearm thing. I saw it on TikTok." "You learned parenting from TikTok?" "Nathan, I learned parenting from the internet, a used copy of What to Expect, and a Dominican grandma who lives downstairs who told me to rub whiskey on her gums, which I'm not doing." She paused. "But Maria also showed me how to swaddle, and that woman can swaddle like a professional, so I'm taking the good with the insane." He almost laughed. She almost smiled. And they stood there in the hallway at 3 in the morning, in a walk-up in the Bronx that cost less per month than Nathan used to spend on dinner. And something passed between them that didn't need words. The months that followed weren't easy. Nothing about it was easy. Forgiveness wasn't a moment. It was a process, slow and uneven, with setbacks and silences, and nights where Elise would go quiet for hours, and Nathan would know, without asking, that she was back in that place. The place where everyone leaves, where nothing lasts, where trusting someone felt like handing them a knife and hoping they didn't use it. He didn't push. He'd learned, the hard way, the only way he'd ever learned anything, that pushing Elise was the fastest way to lose her. So he showed up. Every day. He changed diapers at 4 a.m. He figured out the bottle warmer. He learned that Hope liked being carried facing outward, so she could see everything, and that she hated the car seat with a passion that seemed personal, and that she fell asleep instantly, every time, without fail, when he sang badly, an old Fleetwood Mac song his mother used to hum. He told Elise about that last part one night, after Hope was down. They were sitting on the fire escape, June now, warm enough that the metal wasn't painful to sit on. The 4 train passing in a blur of light and noise. Elise had a glass of cheap white wine. Nathan had water. He'd stopped drinking, not dramatically, not with an announcement, just quietly, because it seemed like the kind of thing a person did when they were trying to be better. "My mom used to sing Landslide," Hornby said. "Not well, she couldn't carry a tune, but she'd hum it while she made breakfast, and I remember, I was maybe 10, asking her what the song was about, and she said, 'It's about getting older and being scared, and doing it anyway.'" Elise looked at him. She was picking at the label on the wine bottle, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as he'd known her. The streetlight caught the side of her face, the freckles on her cheek, the faint scar near her hairline from a fall when she was a kid, the curve of her jaw that he'd memorized years ago and never forgotten. "You never talk about your mom," she said. "I know." "Why not?" He thought about it. The honest answer, not the managed answer. Not the answer he'd give the therapist on Wednesday at 4. "Because my dad taught me that missing her was a weakness, and I believed him for 22 years. He paused. "I don't anymore." Elise didn't say anything for a while. The train passed. The sound faded. Somewhere on the street below, someone was playing music from a car. Something with bass, muffled, indistinct. She reached over and took his hand. Didn't look at him when she did it. Just reached over and laced her fingers through his, the way you do something you've been thinking about for a long time and finally stop overthinking. Nathan looked at their hands. Hers were smaller than his. The nails were short. She kept them that way for work. There was a callus on her ring finger from the way she held a pen. He knew these hands. He'd missed these hands. Neither of them said anything. The city hummed around them, sirens in the distance, the hiss of a bus stopping on the Grand Concourse, the faint laughter of teenagers on the corner. The wine was warm. The night was warm. Hope was asleep in the crib 6 feet away, making those tiny sleep sounds. Not snoring, not breathing, something in between that only babies produce. Gerald Caldwell never replied to Nathan's text, but in April, 4 months after Hope was born, a package arrived at the apartment on Valentine Avenue. No return address. Inside was a small cardboard box, and inside the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a silver rattle, old, tarnished, with an engraving on the handle, CEC, 1991, Catherine Elizabeth Caldwell, Nathan's mother. 1991, the year Nathan was born. There was no note, no card, no explanation. Nathan stood in the kitchen holding the rattle, turning it over in his hands. The metal was cold. The engraving was worn smooth in places from years of use, years of being held, years of being loved by a woman who'd been erased from the Caldwell household like a clerical error. Gerald hadn't called, hadn't visited, hadn't acknowledged Hope's existence in any official capacity, but he'd kept this rattle for 33 years, through a wife's death, through the systematic removal of every other trace of her, and now he'd sent it to his granddaughter. Nathan put the rattle in Hope's crib that night. She was asleep on her back, arms above her head in that starfish position babies love, her mouth open, her breathing steady. He placed the rattle next to her, and she shifted, one tiny hand closing loosely around the handle, fingers too small to grip it fully, but touching it, holding it, the way babies hold things, not with intention but with trust. Elise came up behind him. She'd seen the package. She didn't ask whose rattle it was. She already knew. She put her hand on Nathan's back, between the shoulder blades, just rested it there. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, it was true. 7 months after Hope was born, on a Saturday morning in July, Nathan Caldwell woke up at 6:15 a.m. to the sound of the 4 train and the smell of coffee brewing, the cheap stuff, the Folgers that Elise bought in the big red can because she said fancy coffee was a scam and she'd die on that hill. He lay in bed for a minute. The ceiling had a crack that ran from the light fixture to the corner. The sheets were tangled. Elise's pillow still had the indent from her head. From the kitchen, he could hear her talking to Hope, not in words exactly, but in that musical, nonsensical language parents use with babies, part English, part sound effects, part pure love translated into noise. He got up, walked to the kitchen. The floor was cold under his bare feet. Elise was at the counter, Hope on her hip, pouring coffee with one hand. She was wearing his Bronx Community College sweatshirt, the one she'd bought as a joke, and that had somehow become hers. Her hair was in a messy bun, no makeup, coffee stain on the sleeve. Hope saw Nathan and made a sound. Not a word yet, but something close, something that started in her chest and came out as a burst of delighted noise, arms reaching, fingers grabbing at air. "Morning," Elise said without turning around. "Morning." "There's coffee." "I see that. It's bad coffee. I know. If you want good coffee, you can walk 3 blocks to the place on the concourse, but you're not allowed to come back here and tell me it's better because I already know and I don't care." Nathan took Hope from Elise's hip. The baby grabbed his nose immediately, her favorite move, and laughed. That laugh. The one that was so big for something so small, the one that filled the kitchen and the hallway and the apartment, and somehow the entire hollow space in Nathan's chest that had been empty for 22 years. He kissed Hope's head. She smelled like baby shampoo, and the laundry detergent Elise bought in bulk, and something underneath that was just her, warm, clean, alive. Elise handed him a mug. Their fingers touched. She didn't pull away. Outside, the 4 train rattled past. The morning light came through the kitchen window, catching the dust in the air, turning it gold. The radiator clanked. The faucet dripped. The downstairs neighbor's TV was on too loud again. Some morning talk show, the hosts laughing about something that didn't matter. Nathan stood in the kitchen of a walk-up in the Bronx, holding his daughter in one arm and a mug of terrible coffee in the other, and the woman he loved was standing 3 feet away in his stolen sweatshirt, with a coffee stain on the sleeve, and nobody was watching. Nobody was taking photos, nobody was writing headlines, and he thought, this is what rich feels like. This is a story about 2 people who had every reason to give up on each other, and almost did. It's about a woman who spent her whole life believing she wasn't enough, and a man who spent his whole life believing that love was something you controlled or cut loose, but never something you fought for. It's about the choices we make when we're scared, and the damage those choices leave behind. And it's about the terrifying, beautiful, impossible act of showing up again, after you've already left, after you've already been left, and saying, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and I know that doesn't mean anything yet. But I'm going to keep saying it until it does." Forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's not a speech, it's not a kiss in the rain or a grand gesture at an airport. Forgiveness is a Tuesday morning. It's making coffee for someone who hurt you and handing them the mug anyway. It's letting someone hold your baby, even though every instinct in your body says to protect her from the kind of pain you've already survived. So here's the question, and there's no right answer, only yours. If the person who hurt you the most showed up tomorrow, not with excuses, not with money, not with promises, but just with the truth, would you let them in?